Okay, who attends charter schools in the US? Well, it turns out that the children who attend charter schools are really quite disadvantaged relative to the typical American student. Now, in Missouri, you might say, well, that's because we only have charter schools in St. Louis and Kansas City. And a lot of kids in those two city school districts come from somewhat disadvantaged backgrounds. They're more likely to be poor, for instance. But in most of the United States, there's no such restriction. So the fact that we see charter schools educating disadvantaged students does not have to do with a law. It has to do with where charter schools see demand for their services. And students who are disadvantaged in the United States, they and their families are more likely to feel that they would otherwise be in failing regular public schools. And that's why the charter schools show up there. There's nothing in the law that says they must do it. That's where they are, though. Okay? So who attends charter schools? I'm showing you now statistics from New York City, where I have very special data that allows me to know not only who are the charter school students, but exactly who was in their class before they went and left the regular public schools and went to the charter schools. And of course, I also know everybody who's in the New York City public schools. So if you look, you will see that charter school students are more likely to be black than their former classmates. So they're being pulled out of schools that are somewhat disproportionately black already, but they're more black than their former classmates. And they're much more likely to be black, twice as likely to be black as the average New York City public school student. Hispanic, there's not so much action here, largely because all the action is in the black. But if you look at percent who are poor, who come from a poor background, you can see that the charter school students, over 93% of them are poor, whereas only about 73% of New York City students are poor. So they're much more likely to be poor. Special ed, they're about the same probability of being special ed students. So that's New York City. The other city that we're going to be looking at quite a bit today, because I'm doing a special study on it, is Chicago. And you'll see a similar pattern in Chicago. The charter school students are more likely to be black, much more likely than the average student in Chicago. The Hispanic is basically a sort of a reflection of the black, because I should have said, hardly anyone is white or Asian. So it's basically you're black or Hispanic in these charter schools. There's hardly any whites or Asians. They're slightly more likely to be poor, but they're all quite poor in Chicago, and they're about the same in special ed. Let me just show you these same statistics for St. Louis so that you'll see that there's nothing unusual about New York City and Chicago. Here in St. Louis, I don't have that special data that allows me to compare them to their former classmates, but I do have general data. If you look at the percentage of charter school students in St. Louis who are white or Asian, you'll see that it's really quite low, only 8%, and only half the percentage of white or Asian students in the regular public schools in St. Louis. 89% of charter school students in St. Louis are black, compared to 81% in the regular public schools, a few Hispanics. And then finally, free and reduced lunch. That means that you are within 185% of the federal poverty line. You can see that it's 82% for the charter schools and 69% for the regular public schools. So for every system that we look at, we will see that there are more disadvantaged students attending the charter schools. Now, I'm not going to say that there are no charter schools in the US that don't look like this, because there are always exceptions. That's the nature of being Americans. We're just a diverse set of folks. But this is the national picture of charter schools. Their students are more disadvantaged. And there are important implications of this. The most important one being that when you try to compare charter schools to regular public schools, you can't just compare your average charter school to your average regular public school, because the average regular public school serves a middle-class family who is white and who lives in a suburban area. The average charter school student in the United States is black, is poor, and lives in a central city. Okay, so you can't, that's not an apples-to-apples comparison. You have to try to look at regular public schools that serve a similar population of students. So that's an important implication. The second important implication is that a lot of charter schools in the United States know their audience. They know who it is that they're trying to educate, and they're going to come up with strategies for educating students that are about the sort of students they educate, and that is going to be disproportionately students from poor, minority backgrounds. There are exceptions to that. For instance, there are charter schools that exclusively serve native Eskimos in Alaska. Okay? They certainly are not serving the same sort of population, but this is the modal sort of charter school. Okay. Now, how do charter schools affect the achievement of the students who attend them? This is a pretty obvious question, and certainly the one you would want to know the answer to if you were a parent, and probably if you were a policymaker as well. And I've told you that we can't just compare the average charter school to the average regular public school in the United States. So instead, we're going to take advantage of those lotteries that I said most charter schools have. They have a lottery among their applicants, and use that as a way to produce gold standard evidence of how charter schools are affecting the achievement of students who attend them. So there are only four lottery-based studies of charter schools in the United States. I'm the author of two of them that include all the New York City and Chicago schools. There is a study just out about a week and a half ago of the Boston charter schools. And then there's a study by Mathematica, an organization that does research that is looking at a national sample of charter middle schools. Okay, so those are the four lottery-based studies. So if you have never seen any lottery-based evidence on charter schools before, I would go so far as to say you haven't really seen any evidence on charter schools. These are really the only serious studies of how charter schools do, precisely because they get this apples to apples comparison instead of an apples to orange. All right, so why are they the gold standard? Well, as I said, most of them are oversubscribed, so they hold lotteries. What we do in these studies is we look at students who are lotteried in. Those are the students who win the lottery, so they go to the charter schools. And we compare them to the students who are lotteried out. Those are the students who applied in exactly the same grade to the same school in the same year. There's nothing different about them. Their parents were just as interested. They were just as interested. The only difference is that some got a higher number in the lottery than others. And we get to follow them over time. And you can see that it's just like a scientific experiment, where some people are given the real, say, heart medication. The other people are given a placebo drug. And then you follow them over time and see who does better. It has that nice feature to it that you know that you're comparing apples to apples. So the lotteried in will attend the charter schools. The lotteried out stay in the regular public schools. We just follow them until they go to college, grow up, et cetera. Okay, so we're following them as long as we can. It's a true apples to apples comparison. And it's important to note, because people often don't realize this about randomization, but the key thing is that it ensures that all of the families are equally motivated. They all have the same motivations because they all tried to do the same thing, and it's only the lottery that's made a difference between them. We'll actually also check that the lotteries are random, because we can check that. We can see whether, do more poor students show up in lotteried in than lotteried out. We'll see that they're all random. Okay, just a tiny bit more detail on these studies that I'm going to talk about. I'm studying all the New York City and Chicago charter schools starting in the year 2000, which is basically close to the beginning of those cities' charter school programs. I'm currently focusing on student scores on the statewide exams. That's what I'll show you evidence on. And that's because most of the students in these schools are still pretty young. So they're not going to college yet. So there's no point in trying to follow up with them, because if you're in 8th grade, you're in 8th grade and you're not going to college. Okay? And I'm going to be looking for an annual or per year effect. In other words, if you spent 1 year in the charter schools, what would you expect? If you had spent a second year, what would you expect? And so on. And that's important to know, because when you look at the size of the numbers, you may think, that doesn't seem very big, but you have to realize it's cumulative. Okay? So it's not a one-time thing, but an annual effect. And then I should also say that everything that we know about charter schools in the United States is not about affluent kids from exurban areas, because they don't attend charter schools. So if you were to say to me, my child is an affluent child and he is otherwise going to attend a well-renowned suburban school that has, is famously good at getting kids into good colleges, how would he do in a charter school? The answer is we do not know, because there are not enough students who attend charter schools. And in fact, charter schools don't really have a model that's geared towards that sort of student. Okay?